Welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for coming back. And we have a powerful next presentation with Diana Liverman, whom I already introduced, and Dekila Chungyalpa, who I'll introduce shortly. And this one is about facts and faith together. So we're moving from the ecological to the scientific. So Dekila Chungyalpa is an environmental visionary with decades of experience in designing and implementing global conservation strategies and projects. She's known as an innovator in the environmental field with expertise in faith-led environmental partnerships, landscape and river basin strategy design, and community-based conservation. She's director of the award-winning LOCA initiative at the UW-Madison, Wisconsin, recipient of the 2014 Yale McCluskey Award for the Conservation Innovation, has created faith-led conservation initiatives in East Africa, the Amazon, and the United States. Thank you so much, Dekila and Diana. And Roshi Joan will begin us with some guided meditation.
Oh, I'm so grateful my two old friends are here, whom I met actually in Dharamsala many years ago in a meeting with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, where we were exploring the world that we're touching into today, and that is the environment, and all of the tangled and twisted issues that have primed this catastrophe that we're in right now. And let's take a moment, very much in the spirit of our presenters this morning, for a breath deep in this body and inviting ourselves to find a seat, a place internally where we're grounded, where we're rooted, stable in the midst of conditions. And to remember really why we're here. Which is to renew and affirm our vows to end suffering. So thank you.
So, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this amazing event. I may talk a little faster because I have a lot I want to communicate. I'm a scientist that tends to use PowerPoint, so I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if that is working okay for, oops, I'm a little bit ahead of myself there. Let me go back. So I know that many people who are participating in this are committed climate activists, have probably read a lot about it. But for those of you who want a quick update or are less familiar with what we know currently about what's happening with the climate, I'm providing an overview, particularly focused on the report that I had the privilege to be a lead author for from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But before I go to that, I want to first of all acknowledge that I'm talking to you from Tucson, Arizona. These lands have been stewarded for hundreds of years by the Tohono O'odham, and I want to honor them and their elders. But this photograph is from 2 nights ago from Tucson, because right now we have wildfires burning in the mountains just a few miles away from the city. These are the Catalina Mountains. And it looks like Hawaii, like a volcano. There are so many fires that are outbreaking. The fire service is doing an amazing job of controlling it. But every day over the last 2 weeks, as we go out, we're reminded of the risks of climate change, because the risks of fires like this have increased dramatically because of the human impact on the planet and anthropogenic global warming. And one of the deepest grief that many of us feel, these are the hiking trails where we go to escape the city. And many of these magnificent saguaros are burning. And it's because they're surrounded by an introduced invasive grass, buffalo grass, that makes the desert much more inflammable than it used to be. So I hope you'll join me in hoping that these fires are calmed before they destroy more of our ecosystems and wildlife, although there is a natural fire cycle that is important. But climate change, human encroachment makes these fires much worse than they would be naturally. So just quickly to explain why the greenhouse gases are so important, I do want to remind people that we need some carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, because the sun's energy that reaches the Earth's surface, it would be reflected right back out into space, and we would be living on a freezing world if it wasn't that we had some greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that have kept the Earth at a livable temperature for thousands of years. The greenhouse gases, most of it is carbon dioxide, but, and all these slides will be available if you wish to look at them in more detail. If we look at what's been happening, we've had carbon dioxide keeping the planet at a livable temperature for thousands of years. But what's been happening due to human activity, as many of you know, is that greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, have been increasing. And the latest data I looked at suggested we're now at 417 parts per million. And that is the highest that it has been in more than 600,000 years. And the rise began after the Industrial Revolution in 1750, and it increased particularly since 1950, which many people have talked about the Great Acceleration. So we've gone from 277 parts per million, 417 in just a couple of hundred years. And this is the reason that we're seeing a global warming with all of the other aspects of the climate that are changing. Just to introduce the other greenhouse gases, I have on the right here the trends not only in carbon dioxide since 1975, but in other greenhouse gases, nitrous oxide that is associated with industry and with agriculture, the growth in methane or methane, which has been pretty dramatic, that is partly associated with the livestock industry, but also with our waste dumps around the world. And then there are a series of industrial gases that can cause a lot of warming. We've been doing a good job at controlling some of those, but there are others that are becoming important as well. But carbon dioxide is the one that dominates the warming signal, and it's associated mostly with our use of fossil fuel and industrial processes, but also with land use such as deforestation. So this is what's been happening to the global temperature. And this graph is since 1850, and it includes multiple data sets in order to create scientific consensus. And the takeaway here is that global temperature has risen at least 1 degree centigrade, that's 1.8 Fahrenheit, since the Industrial Revolution. But this is the global average temperature. And one of the things we looked at in detail in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the geography of that warming. And it's very important to acknowledge when we talk about that 1 degree global warming or whether we're going to be able to keep warming under 1.5 degrees C, that some areas are warming much more than others. So the Arctic, the polar regions, land is warming more than the sea, dry lands are warming more than moister areas, and it's warming more at night than it is during the day. So for example, the Southwest US, where I live, is one of the hotspots for warming in our sort of latitude area. Here we've seen a warming of up to 3 degrees Fahrenheit, 1.6 since 1901, one of the reasons why the wildfire risk is worse. And there are parts of the Arctic that have already warmed by more than 4 degrees centigrade or 7 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's very important to keep in mind, is this geography of warming. Another thing that we need to think about, and this has already been alluded to in the first talk, is that it's not just the average climate change of how much it warms each year. It's that around that warming, we have changes in extremes, changes in climate variability. So as the average climate changes, extreme events change as well. And what we're seeing are increases in the risks of hazards and disasters. We see deeper droughts. We see more severe floods. That's partly because a warmer atmosphere holds more moisture. Heat waves are very clearly increasing in many parts of the world linked to warming. And then there is also evidence that severe storms and hurricanes, the intensity is increasing, perhaps not the frequency. And there was a very good IPCC report in 2012, freely available on their website, that looked at some of these questions. Some of the most exciting but also worrying science that's come out over the last couple of years is that scientists have been working very hard to look at some of these extreme events and see if they can be scientifically connected to global warming. And this is very robust work. What they're looking at is the chances that any one event, like Hurricane Harvey or heat waves in Australia, are linked, that whether their chances of occurring are linked to anthropogenic global warming. And the graph here is an analysis of 170 of what are called these attribution studies. Can we attribute extreme events to climate change? And it's an assessment of all of that research. And it shows that there's very robust evidence that heat waves are connected to global warming, drought and flooding. Severe storms, it's less, we're less confident at the moment that all of these severe storms can be directly scientifically connected to global warming, but the research showing that is starting to increase the more events that we have. So let me turn now to the 1.5 report. And the 1.5 report, the IPCC, has been driven by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that I'm sure Christiana Figueres will talk about later today. And in that convention, signed in 1992, countries of the world committed to avoid dangerous or unacceptable levels of climate change, but they didn't define in detail what was dangerous. And this is very important because trying to understand this then defines what the international target for controlling global warming might be. So for a number of years, the UN has assumed that 2 degrees of warming would not perhaps be acceptable, but would be a way of minimizing the danger of things going even higher. So many of the discussions and the reports focused on keeping warming below 2 degrees centigrade, looking at what the impacts would be at 2 degrees centigrade. And you can see this in the Paris Agreement of 2015, where the agreement was to keep global average temperature well below 2 degrees. But there was an interesting thing that came into the Paris Agreement, is that many scientists and a number of countries feel like 2 degrees is half a degree too far, and that would be much lower risk, much less impact, particularly on vulnerable populations, if we were able to limit warming to 1.5. So the Paris Agreement in a preamble or in the decision asked the IPCC, which I'm a member of, to actually do a report looking at what's the difference in impacts between 1.5 and 2, and what would it take to keep warming under 1.5 degrees C. So it was trying to address directly this question of what is dangerous and what would it take to keep us under that dangerous climate change. So this is the report that we worked on. We worked on it for 18 months. There were about 100 of us, and we were assessing the impacts at 1.5 and 2. We were trying to look at what it would take to keep warming under 1.5, and we were also trying to connect it to sustainable development. And this report too is available on the web. It's very detailed, it's very complex. There is a summary that is available. So just to give you a little bit of insight into how we did the report, it was requested particularly by vulnerable countries like the small island states. There were 91 authors plus a few other guest authors. The authors were from 40 countries, and to become an IPCC author, you're nominated by your country as an expert on some aspect of the report. One of the things that was very exciting for me and connects to today is that traditionally IPCC has been dominated by men, but they have been working very hard. I'm on a gender commission for them right now, and the 1.5 report had 38% women authors, which was unprecedented for an IPCC report. We're all volunteers. We do have international meetings, and the one thing the COVID epidemic has done is move IPCC online for the first time in its history. But our group met in person. We reviewed more than 6,000 scientific papers that had been written since the last report. And one of the things about an IPCC report is there are 2 rounds of review where any scientist in the world can provide comments, and then all the governments provide comments. So one of the biggest challenges is that the 90 of us had to respond to 42,000 review comments. You have to respond to every single comment. And then in the end, you have to get the summary of the report approved by governments. And that was a 24/7, 1 week. We almost didn't get it approved because of the objections of a couple of countries, not the US, interestingly, but we did finally get it approved. So what did the report say? I've just summarized the main messages here. We did bring together all the evidence about the climate was already warming. We looked at the impacts that were already occurring. And then we looked at the Paris Agreement and other commitments to act on climate change. And unfortunately, we found that even if those commitments were fulfilled, we might still see a world that would be 3.5 degrees C or more than 6 degrees warmer. And remember, 6 degrees Fahrenheit warmer globally would be a lot warmer in places like Tucson and India and others of the hotspots. Our second major conclusion is that every bit of warming matters. We looked at research, hundreds of papers that looked at what the impacts are at 1.5 and what the impacts are at 2. You might think, oh, that's just half a degree, there won't be a big change. In fact, we found substantially greater damage at 2 than at 1.5, which argues for a 1.5 target or limit. But we then looked at what it would take to keep warming under 1.5. And the thing that really hit the media, the message that people heard, is that we have to make deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions immediately, 50% by 2030, and be net neutral, whereby any emission is compensated by taking gases out of the atmosphere. We'd have to be net neutral by 2050. And then finally, we looked at the link between climate change and the Sustainable Development Goals. 2 degrees really makes it hard to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But even at 1.5, that amount of climate change makes reaching the SDGs more challenging. So just quickly, I'm going to show you a few more details of these main messages. This is the graphic that we use to look at current policies. So you can see here, this is time going up to 2100. On the other axis, we're looking at emissions, and it shows that current policies take us to more than 3 degrees C. And in order to get to 1.5, we've got to make very, very steep cuts in emissions to keep warming under 1.5. This just summarizes a few of the impacts. Kriti will talk more about impacts in her talk later. But in looking at the difference between 1.5 and 2, some of the most dramatic conclusions were that at 1.5 degrees, some of the tropical corals will survive. At 2 degrees, they disappear. Habitat loss increases dramatically from 1.5 to 2. If we could limit warming to 1.5, that would halve the number of people exposed to water stress and heat waves compared to if we let warming increase to 2 degrees. And also, if we can keep warming to 1.5, it does significantly reduce vulnerability to sea level rise and also the number of people who would be thrown into poverty as a result of climate change. Here are the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's a very simple summary on this slide. As I mentioned, 2 degrees makes it much harder to eradicate poverty and hunger, to secure health and clean water, to reduce inequality, including gender inequality. We had a number of scientific papers on that, and it makes it much harder to protect other living things, whether they're in the oceans, rivers, or on land. So this is based on computer models, and we ran models over and over again, trying to figure out how much we would have to cut emissions, how we would need to cut emissions to keep warming under 1.5 degrees. And it is incredibly challenging. This particular graphic I'm showing is more than 100 computer runs. And in many of those computer simulations, we could not keep warming under 1.5. We did find that to have a good chance of staying under 1.5, we'll have to halve emissions by 2030 and get to net zero by 2050. What this means is a step increase in investments in renewable energy and other solutions. And you've got to shift investment in our current energy system away from fossil fuels into renewable and efficiency. The other thing that is important about our report, and has been, people have criticized us for it, is in order to stay under 1.5, you have to rely on bioenergy for liquid fuels. You have to have massive carbon sequestration efforts by planting trees. And you also, by 2030, need to come up with technologies, some of which some people call them magical technologies because they're not economic or viable yet, that actually take greenhouse gases out of the air using mechanical methods rather than biological. In the report, we did look at multiple options for reducing emissions. The cheapest one is always increases in energy efficiency. That saves money for individuals in their homes. It reduces air pollution if women can have access to efficient wood stoves. So you can achieve a certain amount of emission reductions through investments in efficiency. We also looked at reduced energy demand, and there are all sorts of behavioral challenges and options for getting people to use less energy, ranging from adjusting insulating your house, adjusting if you're privileged enough to have heating and cooling, adjusting your thermostat. Rapid transition from fossil fuel to renewables. Another area of criticism, although many countries are making this choice, is that nuclear is a lower carbon option, although it has other risks. And then bioenergy, the challenge here is that to produce liquid fuels using bioenergy, that involves, at the moment, putting large areas into biofuels. which then puts you into a clash with the need to preserve natural ecosystems, to protect indigenous rights to forests, and so on. And it could also threaten food supply. We talked about the protection and expansion of forests and carbon sinks. You have to do that with attention to local rights and indigenous rights and to biodiversity. We did talk about dietary changes, which is moving to more plant-based diets, which I'm sure many of you have done. And then it talks about these technologies that we need after 2030 to take the gases out of the air. This is just a slide, I've actually already mentioned this, to talk about this idea of negative emissions. These are practices that take emissions out of the atmosphere. So it's planting trees, it's agriculture that keeps carbon in the soil, it's bioenergy, and it's carbon capture and storage. But for all of those, there are trade-offs, there are costs, and there are questions about technical feasibility that we could discuss. I'm just showing you this one slide of specifics because people talk about the 1.5 report, but they sometimes misrepresent what we said. This is the pathway with some specific actions that could keep us under 1.5 degrees. It might involve a little bit of overshoot where we go above 1.5 to say 2 and then come back down. But you can see here that by 2030, we'd have to reduce energy demand by 5%. We wouldn't eliminate coal, although it would be better if we did. Reduce coal use by 61%. You can see the increase in nuclear, the increase in renewables, and the importance, the shift to bioenergy. And then by 2050, you can see much steeper cuts. So IPCC has been criticized both for allowing fossil fuels to continue in some countries or for cutting them too steeply. The different sides criticized us from different things. Just to move towards wrapping up, one of the things that I need to share with you is that the IPCC, when we recommended a 50% cut, we didn't say who should make that cut. And there's a reason for that, is that IPCC has to get their final report approved by governments. And if we had pointed fingers, the report never would have been approved and it never would have had the impact that it has had. So it's been up to the rest of science and the climate justice activists to talk about who should make that 50% cut. Should everybody make an equal cut? No, of course not. There should be greater reductions for those countries and people with larger historical emissions, larger per capita emissions, or countries that are importing emissions from other countries. But I did want to mention that IPCC does not address this directly because of the political implications, but I hope we can talk about it. So to wrap up this quick look at the IPCC report and the science, this is the important message now, is that it's already 2 years since our report came out and we haven't acted on it. The longer we wait to act, we've got to make larger cuts, we've got to make faster cuts to keep the world safe. We're going to have to rely more on magical or costly technologies like bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. There'll be a much higher risk that we go into overshoot, where we go higher temperature before it comes back down. And that, the question there is who gets to survive overshoot, which ecosystems get to survive overshoot, and what do we lose during that overshoot period? It makes adaptation much more difficult if we wait to reduce warming, and will undermine sustainable development and the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm going to stop sharing because there is one other thing I sort of want to mention here, is that there are now thousands of climate scientists around the world who are asking these questions and trying to answer them. And I want to acknowledge the hard work of all of those climate scientists and the anxiety that they feel, the grief that they feel. It's really hard. I've been involved with IPCC since 1995, and every report we warn the world that we need to act, and the world does not act enough. So it's tough to keep going, but it's interactions like today that make it worthwhile. So I'll end there and hand over to my friend Dekila.
Diana, thank you so much. And particularly the final note, how you ended your presentation. It's so important for us to acknowledge the grief that we feel and also the moral outrage as we're in the midst of this catastrophe about which many are in denial.
Thank you, Diana.
Dekila.
Hello, Roshi. I am also going to do a presentation, mainly because most of the work I talk about is done by other people. And I find it's a way that balances what I present to visually share with you what other people do. So let me start this. There we go. So I was inspired by Wendy and Stephanie, and I thought I would start my presentation by sharing a photo of when Roshi, Diana, and I first met. This is, I think, almost 10 years ago. We were part of this incredible conversation around ecology, ethics, and interdependence. And our friendship clearly has stayed with us all this time, and we've been very close since. So let's start with where I was in 2007. I was working for the World Wildlife Fund on freshwater conservation and climate adaptation in the Greater Mekong region in Southeast Asia. And I was the youngest field director WWF had at that time. And I got to spend as much time as I wanted in forests and on the water. So you would think that I would have been on top of the world. You would think that, this is as good as it gets. The approach WWF Greater Mekong took to make the Mekong River free-flowing conceptually, the work we did to collaborate with governments and try to get everybody to think about regional adaptation beyond national boundaries, it was all very game-changing at that time. I was really proud of our teams. I was really proud of our local projects, community projects, but I wasn't sleeping at night. And so picking up exactly where Diana left off, I had deep anxiety that was I was basically having panic attacks. What I didn't know at that time was, and I do know now, is that I was experiencing what is now called climate despair and eco-anxiety. And it's a term that's actually now recognized by the American Psychological Association, because so many of us are experiencing this deep grief and mourning and suffering because of environmental and climate losses. In the middle of this, I had a meeting with His Holiness, the 17th Karmapa. He is the head of the Karma Kagyu lineage in Tibetan Buddhism, which is also my family's lineage. I come from Sikkim in the Himalayas, and so my family drags me every year to pilgrimage. And so in one of these pilgrimages, I had this meeting. And His Holiness in that meeting asked me to develop environmental guidelines for monasteries and nunneries. Because he was such an avid environmentalist himself, he wanted something that explained science to the monks and nuns. And I often joke saying that I, of course, said yes, because I was thinking about all the savings I would deposit into my karma bank. And I thought, my next lifetime is secure. This is perfect, makes me a good Buddhist. However, what happened next completely transformed my life. The monks and the nuns I worked with were so hungry for science. They had everything that they were visually tracking, all the transformations in the landscape they were tracking, whether it was monsoon patterns, whether it was increased flood in terms of frequency and intensity, whether it was droughts. What they wanted was the science to explain them why it was happening to them, and then what they should be doing about it. So in the middle of this conversation, what actually emerged was this strong request from the monks and the nuns that we do science training for them. And within 2 years, they had organized themselves into an association called Koryug, which means environment in Tibetan. And each of the monasteries would basically identify the environmental issues that they were most concerned about, that affected their region the most, and focus on that for their projects. So, for example, all the monasteries and nunneries in Nepal chose to focus on 2 things, water and climate change. And so this movement was born, completely unanticipated movement was born, where we had monasteries carrying out reforestation in remote areas of the Himalayas. We had monasteries also trying to restore watershed of Kathmandu. They physically led community cleanups. They got off their brocaded mats, went into the community and literally got dirty, which most communities had never seen. They began integrating wildlife protection messages into their rituals, into their public programs. Over half of the monasteries installed solar in their kitchens particularly. So what does this mean for the Himalayas itself? The Himalayan range is a 1,500-mile barrier, which basically bridges the Tibetan plateau from the south, from South Asia and India in particular. It is incredibly biodiverse. It has, it's home to tigers, to elephants, to rhinos. Oh, sorry, hold on, let me go back for a second. It has over 50 million people that live there, some in very remote areas that depend on nature for their livelihoods, for everyday resources. If you look at the Himalayan region and you look at the Tibetan Plateau, what you see is the importance of the Tibetan Plateau. It's often referred to as the third pole. And the reason is because Tibetan Plateau contains 15% of all the ice on this planet. It has over 40,000 glaciers. And I'm now going to take you left to right. So what you can see is that it gives birth to 7 of the greatest rivers in mainland Asia. So from left, you have the Indus, you have the Ganges, you have the Brahmaputra, Irrawaddy, Salween, Mekong, Yangtze, and Yellow. All of these river sources come from the Tibetan Plateau. And what is happening in the Tibetan Plateau? The temperature is rising 3 times faster than the global average. These 40,000 glaciers that I mentioned are at risk of disappearing by the end of this century. So we have 1 billion people spread out in all of these river basins. And as the glacier melts, what it means is increased floods and decreased water supply. So right when you need more water that comes from the glaciers into these river systems in the dry season, you're actually going to have less water. Now, when I was explaining all of these things to the monasteries, to the monks and the nuns, what was fascinating to me was what their response was. By then I'd already worked for WWF for almost 10 years, and I'd become really, I think, just incredibly defeated, because trying to convince, I'd worked with 9 different governments, countless of NGOs, several corporations, and trying to convince these stakeholder groups that the environment was something that had to be a priority for them, that it couldn't always take 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th place to the economy, was impossible. And here I had monks and nuns who actually occupied very powerful positions of privilege, who became self-motivated just based on the information, who immediately transformed their prayer and their motivation that they make every day to alleviate the suffering of sentient beings into climate and environmental action. And it was self-created. It wasn't something where I was standing in front of them saying, you must do this and you must do that. They actually had this inherent desire to do it. So when we talked about what climate change meant for the Himalayas, their first response was, we want to train on how to manage, how to be prepared so that we can help the community. So what you're looking at is the disaster management guidelines for the monasteries and nunneries. All of this is available online in case any of you are interested. And then CERT, which is the Community Emergency Training Response. So it's a training that's provided for community members, where we have now hundreds of monks and nuns that are trained to be first responders, that are trained to be first aid caregivers, who see their Buddhist responsibility as alleviating the suffering of sentient beings caused by climate change and environmental crisis. when I went back to WWF to say, this is what's happening in the Himalayas, and I think we in the conservation world have made a huge mistake. We have a blind spot when it comes to religions. What they turned to me and said was, well, give us the facts. And so these are the facts that I made to them. 85% of people in the world follow a spiritual faith. Faiths collectively own 8% of total habitable land surface. Faiths set up, run, or are otherwise involved in over 50% of all schools worldwide. They constitute the world's third largest category of financial investors. The Catholic Church is the third wealthiest property owner. Excuse me. Sorry. Okay. I just got distracted by chat, which is a bad idea. And the Catholic Church is the third wealthiest property owner in the world. It owns over 27 institutions just in the US alone. So there are all of these very practical arguments to make about why religions need to be a stakeholder group that is prioritized in climate and environmental work. However, there is a much, much deeper reason why, which is that faith institutions allow us to talk about all the things that we in the science community have put aside. They talk about the sacred value of nature. They talk about morals. They talk about exactly this, that there has to be a reason for human existence beyond the constant accumulation of stuff, which means that they actually question the root cause of why all of this is happening, which is neoliberalism, right? Which is this idea that all our human satisfaction, all of our collective success is based on the economy and economic growth. WWF was really kind and wonderful, and they bought the argument and allowed me to create a program called Sacred Earth. The program was basically a proof of concept. And so I got to work in 5 different places around the world with faith leaders, reach out to them, and pick a conservation target that WWF cared about, and basically convince faith leaders to work on these targets. And I think the relationship could have been, pretty utilitarian, right? However, what emerged was this great heart awakening from faith leaders. So the first time I worked in Africa with faith leaders, we had this huge call to faith leaders who were already involved in sustainable development and who worked with partners of WWF. And we brought them to this site. This is actually the ivory burning site in Nairobi National Park. And what emerged was something very spontaneous. They said they wanted to make a commitment on behalf of their very different institutions, Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, Muslim, Hindu, indigenous. So there were a lot of different faiths represented. Each one of them made a commitment saying they would use their religious institution to start communicating that the ivory trade had to stop and the poaching of ivory had to stop. And that was a religious issue. It was something that we hadn't seen before. And the point they kept making again and again was, how come no one told us this? Which was like, yes, how come no conservation group had gone to them and said, we need your help on this issue? I also got to work in Brazil to work on Amazon conservation. The Pope in 2012 returned to Rio for the first time, Pope Francis, as the Pope. It was the first time he returned to Latin America. And it was for the event called World Youth Day, which is the largest pilgrimage in the world. Over 3 million young Catholics came. And so we were able to promote indigenous rights, indigenous people's rights in the Amazon, make videos and show it to these 3 million people because of our partnership with the Catholic Church and with World Youth Day. And what was really powerful about that was how quickly people's attitude changed, because then they were told that caring for the Amazon as the lungs of the planet was a Catholic issue. And many of them said that was the first time it happened. A similar thing happened in Thailand. We worked with some of the most esteemed and respected Thai Buddhist leaders to talk about how all of this ivory from Africa was ending up in Thailand. And it was illegal ivory that would come to Thailand, get stamped as domestic ivory, which was legal in Thailand, and then would be sent to China. So this was how Thailand was participating and encouraging, aiding and abetting this illegal wildlife trade. And what emerged out of that, again, was Thai Buddhist leaders immediately saying Buddhists should not be buying or selling ivory. And so in each of these cases, what I have seen is that just asking faith leaders to care, to expand their vision, when they say they care about sentient beings, when they say they care about humanity, they care about creation, there is an expansion that automatically happens. And they are willing to take that on. So the question is actually, why wouldn't we work with faith? When it comes to divesting from fossil fuels on climate change, this is absolutely necessary, as Diana pointed out. The faith community has been incredibly responsive, starting with the World Council of Churches, Islamic Society. Catholics have self-reported that they have divested now globally over $5 trillion, Church of England, so on and so forth. I think there's a deeper reason why faith-led climate action is so important. They are actually the heart of a lot of the climate justice language we see now. They are the ones who have been connecting justice with climate action over the last decade. Leaders like Pope Francis have talked about how climate change is connected to inequity and how that inequity is what creates the market that we have today, which is basically, well, when we look at the economy, what do we see? It's a pyramid scheme in itself. There are always losers, and the losers are always the marginalized folks. Going back to COVID-19, I just wanted to mention that when it initially became clear it would be a global pandemic, working with the Koryuk monasteries and nunneries was incredible, because what they said is, we've gone through the planning for climate disaster before. So we are going to use the planning process for climate change and disaster management and apply it and create a COVID-19 preparedness plan. And to me, that is so significant, because it comes right back to the importance of training people in ways where it's not just a general overwhelming amount of information, but what we are doing is activating them to take control of what they can do in their world. And I think that is part of our, going forward, that has to be a huge part of our education and our communication strategy on climate, COVID, environment, whatever it is, that we don't overwhelm people, but we make them feel empowered enough that they can make change where they happen to be. And because of the importance of training, I moved to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and we've created this new program called the LOCA Initiative. The mission of the program is basically, it's an education, capacity building outreach platform for faith leaders and culture keepers of indigenous traditions to work on environment and climate issues. I want to take a moment and return to the beginning of my talk when I talked about eco-anxiety. There were two philosophers I read that really helped me. And I wanted to share them because, as Diana said, and as Roshi also said, many of you are probably experiencing what we have been. And, on a personal level, I am the daughter of a Tibetan Buddhist teacher. I was raised in a very spiritual tradition, raised to meditate at a very young age, and I still struggled with eco-anxiety and climate despair. We have to use all the tools available to us, whether it's medication or not. However, the thing that really helped me conceptually was to come across these two philosophers. One of them is called Glenn Albrecht, and he coined this term called solastalgia. And solastalgia refers to the grief and the suffering indigenous people and others experience when they see in front of them their habitat, the land they are grounded on, changing and transforming for the worse. And he built it based on another philosopher, Carl Jung, who created the concept Anima Mundi. Anima Mundi basically translates into world soul. And both of them are basing their philosophies on indigenous traditions and indigenous wisdom, which is that we who are suffering right now because the earth is suffering are doing so because our sense of self has expanded beyond our body. Our sense of self has included something else we love, whether it's an animal, whether it's trees, whether it's an entire landscape, a river that you went to as a child, whether it's the entire earth. The reason why we suffer is because our sense of self has expanded to include all of that. So actually, our suffering comes from a basis of empathy and compassion. And now when we frame it that way, we have to also see that that is a source of strength. And the one thing we must not do, which actually Western education trains us to do when you're an environmentalist or climate scientist, is to create a barrier between you and what you observe. This dualism that is introduced to you as part of your education. You are a good scientist when you're objective, right? And so what I want to say is bridge that. For us to heal ourselves, we have to bridge that. That oneness that we experience with nature, that oneness we experience with the species or with the planet, that is exactly the thing that's going to heal us. People really look up to Greta, and she created a movement, especially Generation Z is fantastic. If anyone's paid attention to the news, especially today, Generation Z is just incredible. But one thing that people forget is that she actually became an environmentalist because of this suffering. So this year alone, January, May, and June were the hottest months we ever had on record. We know that heat actually increases suicide rates. We know that we are suffering. All of us are experiencing deep despair. For that reason alone, it is critical that we connect our work on climate and the environment to the work for our inner selves and building resilience for our inner selves. We cannot see them as separate issues. So the local vision is to combine psychological resilience, sociological resilience, so community resilience, and ecological resilience. We cannot do any one of these things alone. It has to be intersectional. It has to be combined. It is all interdependent. This is Mount Kanchenjunga, which is where I'm from. This is incredible that this is an entire day of women leaders, because what I'm usually used to is a lot of male leaders talking about the war, a warlike language, the war on climate, the war on environmental degradation. We have lost the war, like all of this language about the war against the planet. I think this is exactly where white supremacy and the history of colonialism, this desire to conquer everything, patriarchy, I think this is exactly what's wrong with the approach we've taken, and why we have a tendency when we want to work on environment and climate issues to prop up neoliberal economic systems that have been the cause of all of these problems, right? We kind of run back to that. We think it's perfectly legitimate that using drones as surveillance for wildlife protection without ever recognizing that there is some kind of dissonance in that thinking. So one thing that I do challenge all of us is that we question whether we further this patriarchal and colonial narrative in the work that we do. And if we do so, then we have to also recognize if 80% of the biodiversity right now is protected by 5% of our whole human race, which is indigenous peoples, who do not have this kind of worldview, then what is it the rest of us are doing that we need to relearn to do again? It is completely possible. I'm showing you the image of Mount Kanchenjunga because this is the third highest peak on this planet, and yet most people have never heard of it. The reason why no one's heard of it is because my people and other indigenous people in Sikkim will never allow it to be climbed. It is a living God for us. It's our protective deity. We have fought off the central government. We have fought off expeditions for 40 plus years, preventing anyone to climb this peak. I think ultimately what I want to come back to is to say that I personally feel that I was protected through this entire journey of leaving Sikkim in the middle of nowhere. I grew up in a very remote, wild part of Sikkim, coming to New York City and then the West, studying here. What protected me was that I never felt separate from nature. I never felt like I didn't belong in wilderness, or that the world was anything but interdependent. My faith always emphasized interdependence and compassion over individualism. And so I feel really lucky about that. I think when we talk about going back to this idea of connecting ecological community and inner resilience, the one thing that I can offer, and the one thing that we, I think, must remember is that all of the climate disasters we're talking about, all of the changes that have happened, the Anthropocene era, it's a blip in a geological time. We have been on this planet for over 200,000 years, and it's just a blip. We can change how we view the earth. We can change how we act. We are part of nature, and it cradles us, humans. It cradles us, just like it cradles any other life form. Now I'm going to end with that. Thank you.
Dekila, thank you so much. Having you and Diana presenting together, of course, took me back to Dharamsala, but also it is like two chambers of one world. And I feel so grateful that your words and Diana's words are resonating with each other in the way that they are at this time. Christiana?
Hello.
Hello. So let's bring Christiana as the steward for this session. And Noah, if you would introduce Christiana, I would appreciate it. And again, thank you, Diana and dear Dekila. And Christiana, Noah will introduce you.
Thank you. I'm so happy to meet you, Christiana. Christiana Figueres, did I say that right? Is an internationally recognized leader on global climate change. She was Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate, assuming responsibility for the international climate change negotiations after the failed Copenhagen Conference of 2009. She led the process to a universally agreed regulatory framework. Building toward that goal, she directed the successful conferences of the parties in Cancun 2010, Durban 2011, Doha 2012, Warsaw 2013, and Lima 2014, and culminated her efforts in the historical Paris Agreement of 2015. For this achievement, Ms. Figueres has been credited with forging a new brand of collaborative diplomacy. Thank you so much, Christiana, for all your work and for joining us today.
Thank you, Noah, and thank you, Roshi, for the invitation. And thank you to Dekila and Diana for your presentations. And I must say, both presentations take me back to the last 2 years of preparation of the Paris Agreement, where one of the most powerful pre-results of the Paris Agreement was the coming together of science and the communities of faith and religious practice. And that was not easy because at that time, they weren't talking the same language. It was a very difficult distance that had to be bridged between the two. And I must say that each of those communities made a huge effort to be able to come together. And we haven't even mentioned the amazing work of the Catholic Church in terms of Pope Francis' Laudato Si, that was written precisely to bridge that very unhelpful discourse that existed at that time, where scientists were looking at one reality, they thought, and spiritual and religious practitioners were looking at another reality, they thought, and it was precisely that coming together that was so powerful. And I would actually even argue, without that coming together, today we would not have the Paris Agreement. So how wonderful, Roshi and Noah and all of you who organize it, to have these two beautiful voices bring precisely bridging that and coming together in one integrated reality. I have a couple of questions. Diana, I'm going to ask you one question, and then Dekila one question, and then I'm going to have a couple of questions for both of you, if I may. Diana, you can imagine you are a scientist. You presented the 1.5 degree report findings quite clearly, and thank you for doing so in a way that we can all understand. But you would be the first one who would admit to the anxiety that comes up when you understand climate from a science perspective. And you know, as you well put out, that we have to halve our emissions over the next 10 years. And then we have to be at zero net by 2050. And barring what we have done with COVID, which was completely unintended consequence, it doesn't look like we're heading in that direction. So from a science point of view, yes, you spoke about overshooting. You also spoke about absorption, both through what I call biological CCS and technological CCS, carbon capture and storage. Is that what gives you hope that we might be able to get on that path? Or are there other factors that I would like to call beyond those, other factors that are more of human self-discovery that give you hope?
Wow, that's sort of a big question. Well, let me start by saying one thing about the reaction to the 1.5 report that came up in the Q&A. A lot of people interpreted our report as if we don't act in the next 12 years, then everything's going to fall apart. A lot of young people contacted us who felt like, what's the point? Because you've said in 12 years, everything's going to end. And whilst I'm glad that people heard the urgency, we didn't say that. We just said, if we don't act in the next 12 years, then we probably won't be able to stay under 1.5, and there will be more damage, but the world isn't going to end. So I've had to spend quite a bit of time, especially with young people, trying to both allay their anxiety whilst not reducing the urgency for action. In terms of how I think about the lack of action that we've seen, I think we cannot stop pushing for emission reductions. We cannot stop doing research on the new technologies. We have to work on our whole suite of activities. But the other thing I've done is I've moved my own research more to questions of reducing vulnerability, because we know that whether or not we stop the warming at 1.5, there are a lot of vulnerable people even now, and there'll be more if the temperature increases. So how can we work to reduce vulnerability? And that's both through larger structural changes like the SDGs, reducing poverty, but it's also doing a lot more work on climate adaptation. I think that both scientists and activists need to be working on reducing emissions and helping people adapt or cope at the same time. So as a scientist, I'm doing more work on figuring out how adaptation can be effective, how it can be equitable. And I'm not giving up on mitigation, but I want to make sure we prepare the world for living in a warmer environment.
Oh,
Can't hear you. Oh, you're muted again.
Okay, I'm here. Some people, Diana, would retort exactly with your last thought there, that, and this is why I would like to invite you to clarify, because some people would say, if you turn your attention to adaptation, then have you given up on mitigation? And you well put that if we don't do enough emission reductions quickly enough, we're just never going to be able to adapt enough. And there is a direct relationship, unfortunately, a direct inverse relationship between mitigation and adaptation. Yes. So how do you, as a scientist, fully well knowing the impact of emissions rise, how do you bring those two commitments that we all have, both to reduce emissions as well as to prepare and strengthen our vulnerability, or strengthen our resilience to vulnerability? How do you bring those two together in a way that do not contradict each other?
So one of the things I try to do is, as a scientist, look in the scientific literature for what I call the triple wins. I look for the examples, whether it be renewable energy or water planning, where these projects have been able to reduce emissions and help people adapt and have reduced poverty. So one of my own students worked throughout Central America looking at renewable energy projects, and she found out that renewable energy was not just reducing emissions, it was also allowing people to recover faster after disasters. Well, this is your own region, so I'm sure you know this, but renewable solar and small-scale hydro were helping reduce emissions, helping people adapt to extremes, and reducing poverty. So that's where I see some of the hope, is in those triple wins. I think where I have anxiety is how do we scale those up globally? Because it's easy to find those good stories. We can find some larger scale ones, but it's hard for me, even scientifically, to add it all up to the global level of a triple win.
Yeah. No, the triple wins are definitely the sweet spot that we look for. Dekila, if I could turn to you, I was very impacted by your mentioning of the importance of language, because the language that we use, if it's a warlike language, it really shows what our thinking is behind that language. And as we know, everything starts in thought. So I would love to hear from you, what alternatives are you using to the warring language of, battling against climate change, the war on climate change, the war on inequality, all of those terms that are so aggressive and that denote, I think, a very, curiously enough, and perhaps ironically, an unloving approach to the challenges that we have. And so I would love to hear your alternatives to that, because I think it's something that we could all use right away. One of the tools that we can immediately implement is be very, very mindful of stand at the portal of thought, but also at the portal of speech. And both of those go together. So what alternatives would you suggest?
I love everything you said. And I think for me, this process of working with faith leaders has been the most rewarding, nourishing experience, because I feel they started teaching me to look at the mistakes I had made in my thinking, and that I had absorbed through time, through my education, through the work I did in conservation. Part of that started with the fact that I could never get any faith leader to care about the environment unless I started with talking about love. And I started talking about interdependence, compassion, and gratitude. And every single conversation that sparked a partnership, that sparked a faith leader to shift, I work with a range of faith leaders, including evangelical leaders in the US. Every conversation that sparked a partnership started because we started talking about what we had in common, what we cared about the most, and what was the bridge we wanted to build to understand each other and meet halfway. And so it's fascinating to me, and I'm sure, I know you have a wealth of information as well, expertise as well. What's fascinating to me is when I look at movements and who leads different movements. Everything I learned about using a different language, using a language that invites people into our in-group, actually came by understanding women who are community leaders, like local community, who are holding it together with zero resource, zero help, who are so often eclipsed when the media arrives by some person either coming in from outside or some man standing up and speaking for them. And so to me, there are certain movements that I watch with some kind of fascination and horror, which are really pushing this dialogue about humans having to fight other humans who are terrible. And what we're doing is, instead of all of us expanding our in-group to understand that ultimately, I mean, the Dalai Lama talks about it all this time, so I'm now taking his words, but that ultimately we are the same. We want exactly the same thing. We want happiness. We want our loved ones to be okay. We want to make sure we protect them. And so I think understanding the in-group concept from sociology was really helpful, because it also allowed me to work with people. You know, here I am, a Buddhist, a Bhutia woman from the Himalayas, and I get to work with evangelical pastors all over the US. And my goal is not to tell them what to do. My goal is not to change their worldview. My goal is just to say, can we expand your in-group so you care? Who else do you care about that's impacted by climate change? And what we find is that evangelicals are incredibly generous around disasters, climate-caused disasters. And that is enough, you know? That's enough for me to build that bridge with them.
Well, let's push into that just a little bit more for both of you, because this is designed as a female leadership conversation today, quite wonderfully. And I'm struck, and I hope all of you have noticed how recently those countries that are led by women have been doing so much better on COVID-19. You know, if we needed an example and a testament to that. But I would love to know, both of you have devoted your lives to working in areas that have been traditionally male dominant. And Diana, you mentioned that, and how that has been changing recently, but still insufficient. And Dekila, for you, it's very evident that on the ground activism has, perhaps because of the activities that are needed, has also been male dominant, but very much getting into female leadership. So I would love to hear from both of you your experience of stepping into these two roles, separate but very complementary roles that you have on this challenge. As women, has it been evident to you that you are women stepping into this role? Have people given you that feedback? And what would you say to, so, you know, hundreds of, we now have 992 participants on this line. I'm sure there are many wonderful men on the line, but most of them are going to be women. So what would you share from your feminine leadership perspective?
So I've been in climate science for 40 years. And when I first entered the field, there were a handful of women, though I will say that some of the first IPCC report only had 3 women authors, but they were really powerful women. And over my career, I've seen more and more women come into climate science. I've also seen many, many women be mansplained. Rebecca Solnit's on the authors of that term, over and over again in meetings. And so actually a few years ago, myself and a student decided to survey all of the women who ever participated in IPCC. It's a very interesting survey of the women climate scientists of the world. And I was really actually quite horrified at the stories that were told of them feeling, they felt that even when they're bought into science and, you know, they're represented, but their voice is not heard. So one of the things that's been rewarding is, as a result of that research and a lot of activism around women in science, is that IPCC now has a gender policy. But one of the challenges that international science faces is that, especially if women are being nominated by their governments, there's a lot of discrimination within government bureaucracies. And so the problem is actually I think probably you've seen the same thing with women delegates to the UNFCCC. You need the governments to take those policies seriously. And you need perhaps quotas to force some governments to nominate women, but you also need a pipeline. So everybody who has a young woman of their acquaintance, encourage them to go into science. It's, even though I've had a tough time, it's also been wonderful. It's so rewarding to work in science, and things have improved. I did want to mention one thing about women leaders and COVID and draw the parallel between women leaders in climate science. One of the things I always found fascinating was that the two women leaders that took climate change seriously earlier on were Margaret Thatcher. I disagreed with a number of her policies, and Angela Merkel. And what's interesting is not only they were women, but they were both trained scientists. And they took the climate science very seriously earlier on. So not only would I like to see more women leaders, I'd like to see more women leaders who are trained in science to help us address the climate problem.
Fabulous. I come from a family that still practices a certain amount of matrilineal traditions. And so I'm not sure I thought through the process of being a feminist as much as I inherited being a feminist. And I
didn't have any option.
I didn't have an option, being in the family I was in. And the only twist I could add to it was I came across ecofeminism and was like, aha, this is how everything is interdependent. And the thing I love the most, nature, is now interwoven as part of my feminism. But working in conservation was incredibly hard. It's, you know, I sometimes describe it as the last bastion of white colonial thinking, because there's just such a tendency for men to dominate that field, and women often get drowned out in that field. And WWF had a policy that we had several field directors that were women, but still at the end of the day, the decision making, it still was a pyramid, and it still was very dominated by men. I think where I feel very lucky is that because I was in field programs and I represented and came from the field program I worked in initially, which was the Himalayas, I had this little window of opportunity where I could just stand up and say, this is what I think because it's the best for my field programs. And I know this because I come from there. And I think that kind of authenticity is the only thing that gave me courage to speak out. It takes an incredible amount of courage, as we've all experienced this in our careers, to stand up and say in front of everybody something is unethical, someone is harming someone else, or someone is harming us, right? And then because of what I was hearing among colleagues in the field, I was also really struck and able to talk about safety for women who worked in conservation, because that's something none of us were ever trained in. We were just, you know, you went through your education, just thrown in, and you are now in the field, and all of a sudden everyone's target. It's just like you're in the crosshairs. You know, you're young, you're to a certain extent naive, and so I found myself becoming a safety mentor in a way for the next generation of conservation women leaders. And, you know, it's something I talk about very openly. I use every opportunity to talk about. Sometimes it's not very popular. People ask me why I bring it up in the talks I give. And it's like, this is the only way I can tell women, you have to protect yourself. And that this is something you have to be prepared for. Because if you're prepared for it, you can withstand it. You have a plan, right? And so I think these are all different elements of what women go through that just never surfaces, whether it's in decision making, whether it's in, you know, allocating capacity, allocating money, resources. I mean, these are all the things that women withstand that men don't have to, that just somehow never comes up to the surface. And I think it's one of my side missions to make it bubble up. Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting because I think what you both have pointed to is that male leadership has many inherent factors that men don't even have to think about, because it's just so ancestral. It just flows on its own. Whereas our leadership is relatively incipient, relatively new, and must be much more intentional. We have to think about these things much more. We have to prepare for these situations so much more. We have to, Diana even, spoke about quotas that some people like and some people don't, but they represent factors that we have to consider in order to begin to open up that space. And also, it's not just the quantification space, the quantity of the space, it's the quality of the space that we have to open, because we bring a very different qualitative leadership that is very necessary right now. But that needs to be intentionally, very, very intentionally fertilized and brought forward. One of the programs, Diana, for you and also for you, Dekila, one of the fantastic programs that I know about leadership for women in STEM, as well as in community, is Homeward Bound, that takes you to Antarctica, and has a fantastic leadership program there. That I can recommend. But what I definitely appreciate is how many new opportunities there are for women to train, to get ready to go into spaces that that we're just tiptoeing into, but are doing a pretty good job as we tiptoe into that. We are running out of time, sadly. We have time for one more question that is a tricky question. That's why I left it for the end. And it's a question for both of you. We know that in order to halve emissions by 2030 and get to net zero by 2050, we will have to do a very, very different use of our land, of our forests, of our biofuels, etc. That can be very difficult if it is not properly prepared, if it's not properly planned, and if it does not respect indigenous rights over land, if it is not brought out, if it is not stems out of basically a place of love for the land and for those who live on the land. If it is a top-down measure, it can be quite destructive. And so I would love to hear from both of you some thoughts, because yes, you could think of those two things as trade-offs. I prefer not to think of it as a trade-off. I prefer to think of it as one of those areas in which we're invited to explore the complementarity between what science needs and what we humans can actually bring. But would love to hear from both of your experiences. How do you see those things that from many perspectives are really quite prickly?
So I'm actually going to leave most of the response to Dekila because she's worked more on that. But if you permit me, Christiana, there's been a lot of questions in the chat about nuclear power, and it does relate to this and trade-offs, because when we look at, when IPCC and other groups look at how do we get to reduce emissions, you can make a whole set of choices, but you really want to bring everything in the portfolio to the table. But if we decided, for example, that controlling land use and violating indigenous rights was unacceptable, what do we put in the place of, you know, planting large areas with bioenergy? And what I wanted to just address in the Q&A is that IPCC did not promote the use of nuclear energy. We looked at it as part of the portfolio to see if it was socially acceptable, what role would it play in reducing emissions? And we did recognize that there's a significant number of countries, France being the best known, with 70% of its energy from nuclear electricity, which is why their emissions are so much lower than other countries. And so it is a question of risk benefit. And there are scientists, and I think this does help answer your question about land use and the trade-offs, is that there are scientists who have now decided that yes, nuclear is risky, but the risks of climate change are even riskier. And so they may have opposed nuclear for a while, but with developments in technology, they're now saying it's one of the only ways to get the emissions down fast. In IPCC, we point out that the reason nuclear is probably not going to be much of the solution is that it's socially unacceptable in most countries, and we saw that in Japan. So I just wanted to briefly address the large number of questions who were shocked that IPCC considers nuclear as part of the portfolio. On the land use and indigenous question, because we're running out of time, I'm going to leave it to my friend Dekila.
Thanks, Diana.
The easy part. But before you answer that, Dekila, could I just say one more thing on nuclear? The fact is that nuclear, not just from a social point of view, but just from a safety point of view, nuclear could be deployed if it is fourth generation nuclear, which is the safest that there is there. And in order to go to fourth generation nuclear, that per kilowatt or per megawatt cost is so high and continue to go high that anyway, it's going to be very few countries that can afford that. And so if you think about the fact that cost of nuclear is continuing to rise because of the threats of nuclear, because of the risks, but the costs of renewable energy are continuing to decrease, then you see two completely different cost curves and competition. And you already have in Texas, of all places, you already have a concentrated solar power that is actually nuclear level capacity, because solar power is so much cheaper. So, you know, I don't think we necessarily will have to regulate nuclear out. There would probably never be an agreement on that, but it might just cost itself out. So we'll see. But Dekila, you have the last word on probably the most prickly question of all.
It's so huge. I think I'm going to just take one small part of it and just say that when we think about our solutions, one of the things we did by taking the sacred out of the science is we dropped having a criteria based on values. When we thought about problem solving, all of a sudden that criteria just disappeared. And so when we think about solutions, I think part of what we need to do as leaders is bring that criteria back. If we have a solution that doesn't fix all of the underlying inequities of geographies, race, gender, which has been bearing the actual costs for this economy, right? For the way we think our economies and our people are thriving. In reality, all we've done is create winners and losers. And the losers are always the same marginalized people. We've decided they're expendable. So now if we have a solution and we don't apply a criteria that's based on values and morality, then we are just perpetuating a system that's based on inequity, that's based on harming and creating suffering for other people for your own gain. And that system is unsustainable. Look at what's happening. There's literally a civil rights uprising globally because people are connecting all of these different issues. People are connecting that climate is related to race, it's related to politics, it's related to gender, it's related to transgender issues. It's all these different inequities that people are waking up to saying, oh, it's one and the same thing. So I think our solution has to be equally adaptive. And we have to turn to our elders and we have to turn to indigenous wisdoms and spiritual leaders to say, yeah, listen to them and say, yeah, it's time. It's time we bring that kind of thinking back to our solutions.
Deep listening. I love it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to both of you. Thank you for the conversation. And Roshi, back to you, I think straight on time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christiana and
Thank
Dekila and Diana. This was an extraordinary session. I'm going to invite us into an hour-and-a-half break. And before that break, a good breath together as we let what we've learned this morning, not only in terms of content, but also the spirit that's been transmitted by our friends in this circle. And that we will also meet again in an hour-and-a-half where Christiana, Jane Fonda will do the next level of exploration. And also our beloved friend, Heather McTeer-Toney, will steward that session. So please rejoin us again in an hour and a half. And thank you. And breath.